Morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask those in-house if you'll be so kind to see that cell phones have been muted as we prepare to begin as a courtesy. And, of course, our internet viewers are reminded that they can send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. It is my privilege to introduce our special panel today and as well our special moderator. Moderating the panel will be John Amble, who is managing editor of War on the Rocks, a web magazine on defense, foreign policy, and strategy. He writes on terrorism, intelligence, the Middle East and Africa, and the military. He is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer and a veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he served at the Defense Intelligence Agency as part of the Defense Department's Chief Counterterrorism Intelligence Task Force. He is a PhD candidate in the Institute of Middle East Studies at King's College London. He holds an MA in Intelligence and International Security, also from King's College London, and a BA from the University of Minnesota. Frank Hoffman is currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Prior to this position, he worked for over 30 years with the U.S. Marines and the Department of the Navy. His military service included tours with the 2nd and 3rd Marine Divisions as an infantry officer. He retired from the Marine Corps Reserve in 2001 as a lieutenant colonel. Dr. Hoffman was the Distinguished Military Graduate of the University of Pennsylvania in 1978. He also holds master's degrees from George Mason University and the Naval War College. He earned a Master of Philosophy and a PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I do like the fact that we seem to gravitate to London here. Anglophile, sorry. Paul Scharr is a Senior Fellow and Director of the 20YY Warfare Initiative at the Center for New American Security. From 2008 to 2013, he worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he played a leading role in establishing policies on unmanned and autonomous systems and emerging weapons technologies. Mr. Scharr was involved in the drafting of policy guidance in the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, and Secretary-level planning guidance. His most recent position was Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He has also served as a Special Operations Reconnaissance Team leader in the Army's 3rd Ranger Battalion and completed multiple tours to Iraq and Afghanistan. He is a graduate of the Army's Airborne Ranger and Sniper Schools and honor graduate of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Ranger Indoctrination Program. Lauren DeJong-Schulman is the Deputy Director of Studies and the Leon E. Panetta Senior Fellow at the Center for the New American Century. Ms. Schulman most recently served as the Senior Advisor to National Security Advisor Susan Rice. Before returning to the White House in 2013, she was Chief of Staff to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, advising on security policy issues related to Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Russia. She served as Director for Defense Policy on the National Security Council staff from 2011 to 12, contributing to the 2000 Defense Strategic Guidance. She also worked as a Special Assistant to Secretary of Defense Robert Gates and is an affiliate of the Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. And ending the panel will be Justin Johnson, who serves here at Heritage in Defense and Budget Policies for our Allison Center for National Security and Foreign Policy. Prior to joining the foundation, Mr. Johnson spent over a decade working on defense and foreign policy issues on Capitol Hill. His last position on Capitol Hill was a Deputy Chief of Staff and Military Legislative Assistant to Representative Doug Lamborn, who at the time was senior member of the House Armed Services Committee. Mr. Johnson received a master's degree from the Naval War College with an emphasis on terrorism and the maritime domain, and received his bachelor's degree from Covenant College. Please join me in welcoming our colleagues here, and we'll turn it over to John.
Thanks very much. As I said, I'm John Amble. As I was very kindly introduced, I'm also the lucky one up here today because as the moderator, you don't actually have to know all that much compared to everybody else, which makes it a lot easier. Thankfully, we have 4 very smart people on defense reform issues so I think that if I don't know a whole lot about defense reform now, I will in an hour. And I recognize that after telling you essentially that I don't know a lot about defense reform, you don't want to hear a lot from me. So I'm going to keep this brief, but I do want to start with one observation, and that's that the reason that I can say that I don't know a lot about defense reform, and I think a lot of people can say that, is because it is probably, without comparison, the most inside baseball issue in the defense and international security space, or national security space. It's very Washington, D.C. I've never had a job where I've had to deal with defense reform, which meant that I didn't really think a lot about defense reform. I didn't work on the Hill, I didn't work in administration or the Pentagon or a think tank. But I did wear a uniform, and so these issues really affected me, but I wasn't thinking about that. So I think that this event plays kind of a particular role in the way that it's framed, because we're going to be talking about ways to kind of broaden the way we conceive of defense reform. We think about acquisitions and personnel systems, but we're going to be talking about how we can kind of expand our view of defense reform. And I think that's important for kind of popularizing the issue, because there are so many stakeholders that just aren't thinking about it and aren't talking about it. And I think that this is the type of event, the type of conversation that we should be having. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over, Frank, if you want to start, make some opening remarks and give some brief thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm the token representative on this stage. You might think, in what way, but I think I'm probably the elder statesman on the panel, and that everybody else is brighter. They still have cells that are growing in their brains. I'm embarrassed to find out during the I'm embarrassed to find out that somebody on the stage was born after I took my commission in 1978. So that probably reflects my age. So there's at least somebody here who maybe is providing some experience, if probably no wisdom whatsoever. I think the subject of reform is more important. A few years ago, I wrote an essay. I think I was commenting on one of Mr. Gates' speech in a presentation up on the Hill, and I was kind of poo-pooing reform as the kind of the set of panaceas. One time, everyone in Washington hears a lot of when we have these crises or we have dilemmas, as we have today, where our ends, our ways, and our means are not very well linked, and we have more demand for things than we have resources to pay for them. And I kind of poo-pooed acquisition reform. I poo-pooed more jointness. I poo-pooed roles and missions, and I think I poo-pooed all forms of reform over the kind of hard calls. But I would go backwards today, and I would say that reform, I think, is absolutely necessary. We're spending a lot of money doing a lot of things in a lot of ways that we don't need to do, and every dollar that we're spending on doing things in an old-fashioned way that has accreted over 200 years. Or in the case of the Marine Corps today, which is celebrating its 240th anniversary of unexcelled combat experience, undiluted or unblemished by any adaptation or thinking, is a problem for us, because every dollar we do waste is another dollar of a mission that doesn't get covered, or a hole that exists in our national security architecture. So I'll give a little bit of a shameless plug. After you get done reading the Heritage Foundation's really great product, the 2016 Military Index, that's the most popular book, or should be the #1 reading book on your list. But the #2 book, if I could shamelessly plug something from NDU, is a book on what we've called lessons encountered. We've not called them lessons learned, and you may understand why. Because we don't believe that they actually have been absorbed. We don't believe the behaviors have been changed in several layers of our military national security architecture, from the start on the NSC, where I'd like to talk today, but even lower and lower levels down. So I have a chapter in this particular book, and I studied the NSC largely, and the interrelationship between the chairman's office, the NSC, for the surge in 2007 and the Afghanistan surge in 2009. It's not quite a comparative analysis, because that would have gotten political, and we're not political at NDU, so it has more of a scholarly kind of thing. But you can get this particular document online if you don't want to buy one from GPO, or you can't have a friend at NDU. But at National Defense University Press, you could find this book, and I think you'll find something interesting in there. So my remarks today kind of come from this year-long study kind of effort. You may be familiar with a famous quote. When George Kennan took over the strategy planning department over at the State Department, his boss was George Marshall, retired general of the Army. Although generals of the Army never retire, I'm told. And Kennan asked Marshall, what the hell should I do? This is a new job, it's a new office. And Marshall said, avoid trivia. And that's sort of been a joke for many of us. If you get in the planning business, avoid trivia. I think if a modern person comes to Washington, D.C. and has to talk about a new job or a new job at the NSC, if you're going over there, I think the advice would be avoid inertia. And it's an inertia that comes about from an accretion of very strong, stovepiped institutions that constitute our current national security architecture. And if you're at the NSC level, like Lauren's worked, you have to deal with that. And you have to harness the positives and the insights of those different agencies, and you have to blend them. And the study that I did suggests that that's a very difficult task, particularly the way we're organized today. So in my presentation today, I'd like to talk about three things about reforming in the National Security Council level of our thinking. And the three elements that I'd like to talk about are the planning function, how we make strategy, the implementation oversight function, how we execute and adapt that area, which I found a lot of weaknesses in, and thirdly, how we support that with what I would call human capital reforms. So the planning conversation deals with, in my particular paper, an issue of should we formalize the planning and interagency community more than we currently have the NSC, where we have an architecture of principals and deputies committees over time where people represent their best interests, and the NSC staff's supposed to be some kind of an honest broker. And I critique an article by a friend of mine, Paul David Miller, who's a former NSC staffer, who wrote, and he liked the planning model that Dwight Eisenhower had in the late 40s and early 50s at the NSC staff. And I didn't like that particular model because it sounded very formalized, and it was tied to the 1950s, and it supported Eisenhower's mentality, but I don't think it would support the current leader, the commander-in-chief, or maybe future commander-in-chief. Eisenhower came out of 30, 40 years in the military. He was into the ritual of planning. He liked formal processes and formal planning. I think, well, that's just a system that's going to support Ike, but not future presidents. I can't see. Truman rejected that model. I think Kennedy also rejected that model. But in fact, after analyzing it, looking at the experience the last couple of years, I've decided we actually need to go back to formal planning boards at lower levels, not at the higher levels we currently have, and create cultures of interagency professionals in the planning and strategy development world that are pushed down into lower levels. And they could brief the principals committee, and they can brief the president, but we should have some kind of formal planning board process. And I end up having to agree with the same thing on implementation oversight. The NSC, over a number of years and decades, and I've interviewed the last 3 or 4 national security advisors, have this model that Brent Scrowcroft and Mr. Gates have expounded on, what's called the honest broker model, where the NSC staff is supposed to be some sort of intellectual eunuch or something, and they're just supposed to make sure that the room is all set up and that the players are all there and that there's an even contest and all the options get aired out for a decision. And that honest broker role is very good for supporting a collaborative discussion and discourse on strategy, and it gets you right up to the decision point. But where I've found it kind of breaks down is if that's all the NSC staff and the NSC advisors see their role, then implementation, adaptation, reassessment, and altering your plans and strategy, it becomes a weak or a non-existent function. And so I'm interested in in this paper, some sort of implementation board. And the same thing, it would be constituted of insiders and outsiders, unlike today's system of just insiders who are representing their department, who are there to advance the interests of their institution, perhaps a little bit too strongly. In a world, in an operating environment where I think the kinds of threats and the kind of challenges we have to face require much more integrated at the strategic, operational, and tactical level, as the veterans, I think, on the stage would attest to. Stovepipes just are not going to be effective in the environments and the kind of threats that we have in the 21st century. So to support that better planning and implementation oversight kind of mechanism, I think we need some human capital reforms. The National Defense Panel in 1996, the Hart-Rubin Commission that I was on in 1999 to 2001, and the Project for National Security Reform have all recommended the establishment of a national security professional cadre You can castigate it as mandarins, but I actually just like to see it as career mobility, career opportunities, education, incentives, and infrastructure for a very mature, experienced, seasoned group of wise people at a variety of ages, so that we get better planning, more interagency interaction, better oversight of our national security strategies at all levels. And Mr. Bush, a number of years ago, by executive order, tried to create this, and OPM stood something up. It just hasn't been implemented, I think, with the scale, with the infrastructure, and the educational programs. And during the Q&A, we can talk about the kinds of initiatives in interagency education, not in defense, not at the State Department, or not necessarily in civilian schools, where we can kind of create the culture, the processes, and the lexicon of 21st century national security planning and implementation. It's something I think that we're weak in. And I think some sort of cadre would be a way of creating that culture and creating the incentives so that we create an interagency community that can work at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. And with that, I'll turn the stage back to you, John.
Paul?
Oh, thanks. Is this on? Can you guys, is this?
It's mostly for online.
Okay, yeah. So I want to shift gears for a second and talk about inside the Pentagon, inside the Puzzle Palace, and then, I don't know, maybe Lauren will take it in a different direction. But I guess what I want to, in the interest of expanding this conversation beyond acquisitions, there's this issue of how we buy things, that's acquisition. But I want to talk about what we buy and how we decide what to buy, how we adapt, which I think is really critical. You've got a couple things going on in the department right now in DoD. You've got a lot of work that Frank Kendall is doing on acquisition reform. You've got this new offset strategy, which is about sort of investing in a certain set of capabilities. But then you have this broader idea in defense innovation, and how do we just be more adaptable and innovative? So what does that mean? I would suggest that we have a pretty bad track record at this. When I look back at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I'd give us maybe like an F+ in innovation. I think maybe a plus because we got there eventually. We eventually got a counterinsurgency manual years later than we should have, and the right tactics on the ground. We eventually got MRAPs and ISR and better body armor for troops, but it took a long time. And the main obstacle wasn't the technology, it wasn't industry, it wasn't people on the ground realizing they didn't need it. It was the Pentagon getting in the way, actually. And it was our bureaucratic system. So, we've very much modernized our military in the last, 20, 25 years, but we're still using this bureaucracy that we've inherited from the Cold War. When we were fighting an adversary who had an even more cumbersome and ridiculous bureaucracy, so it was okay then, but it doesn't work today, and it's getting in the way. So, and when you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, in order to bring all of these adaptations to the field, you basically had to have people go around the system. So Secretary Gates had to, and maybe I'm going to lob this one to Lauren, maybe she'll talk about this because I'm pretty sure she was involved in some of these efforts, but maybe Secretary Gates had to basically fire these silver bullets personally at problems, creating things like ISR task force, MRAP task force, to sort of push these things out to the field. So how do we make that process organic? And when I look at how the department is thinking about future conflicts, we're just not quite there yet. A lot of this talk about offset is motivated by adversary investments in anti-access capabilities, or anti-access area denial, A2AD. This is not a new problem. People have been aware of this problem, been admiring it for about 10 years now. We've done an okay job. I'd say we're partway there in making the right investments. Things like we have a new bomber program that's getting underway. That's an important piece of the puzzle. But there are other areas where things are lacking very sorely behind. The Navy's in the midst of this sort of protracted struggle about whether or not it's going to invest in serious unmanned aircraft off of an aircraft carrier, which it basically needs to stay relevant in anti-access environments. And they've had a lot of help from Congress. I think it's actually very positive in trying to steer them in a good direction. So what are the obstacles standing in our way? I think there's the number one thing is time. It's that the time it takes for us to do things is so long, it takes decades to get things to the field, that there's this sense of inertia that's very difficult to overcome. So every time we do a QDR, we get into these debates about whether it's the strategy or the budget that drives what we do. The answer is it's neither. It's inertia. What we do this year looks a lot like what we did last year and the year before. And it's driven in large part by bureaucratic incentives internally. That you have, it's not just the services, it's within the services you have different tribes, different communities that then have certain constituencies. And they tend to do things that just look like what they used to do, right? Was in a series of conversations earlier this year, some very innovative young Navy leaders that the Navy's been trying to sort of help sort of foster a community where they can discuss innovation. And one of them sort of teed up to the group. He said, look, I've been tasked to think about a next submarine. What are the things we need in a next submarine to stay relevant undersea? And the answer that many other young Navy officers said was, well, what if it's not a submarine? What if what we need to be dominant undersea in the future is undersea autonomous unmanned vehicles that are operating together in a swarm? What if it's undersea payload modules that lie in wait? What if it's other things and a submarine is part of it? But the answer is not another big, expensive submarine. And the answer he came back with was great, which was, I totally agree with you, but that's not what I've been told to do. What I've been told to do is, what's the next submarine going to be, right? And so that's actually what drives things. So, so this changing how we fight, how we think about what we do is really challenging. Lots of people make comparisons to the interwar period between World War I and World War II. I think it's a very apt comparison, where you had a lot of new technologies like aircraft and tanks come about in World War I, but they were at early stages, people trying to figure out what to do with them. And we saw that what really mattered in that period was experimentation, was building prototypes, trying many different things, letting things fail. And that's a challenge for us. Now, I will end on a positive note, which is that I do think that people involved in the Pentagon and on the Hill are aware of this and are putting their shoulders into this problem. We're trying to move a big building. I like to imagine when I look at the Pentagon, it's this giant edifice, right? But the weight of the bureaucracy inside is much heavier than the weight of the concrete alone, right? It has much deeper roots. And so you've got, I think, very good people in Frank Kendall and Bob Work and Ash Carter, and on the Hill, Senator McCain and many others, sort of putting their shoulders into that building and working to turn it. But it's going to take time. But I am hopeful that there's progress to be made. So with that, I'll stop rambling and hand it over.
I'll make a couple comments on some of the points that Paul raised, then turn it over to NSC reform issues. And first, so you brought up the great example of Secretary Gates and the challenges that he faced in the Pentagon and the need to, as you say, fire the silver bullets to cause any sort of innovation, forward momentum during the 2009 surge period. And what's interesting to me about that is that Secretary Gates was micromanaging the Pentagon. He was absorbing a lot of the lower level functions, whether in the service staff or the AT&L staff, into his office to say, I personally need to oversee some of this. I don't trust you to do that. So that works temporarily. But what it doesn't do is translate those lessons down into the system to say, we're not going to do that actually in the future. In the future, you're going to do a better job later on. By setting up temporary task forces or temporary functions within his office, it was incredibly effective for the fight that we were in then, but it's not going to be effective for the fight that we're going to be in the future. The building hasn't learned those lessons. But the micromanaging problem is one that you see in the NSC as well, and I'll talk to that separately. And actually, I'll get to the failure challenge I was going to talk about in Q&A. So I also want to talk a little bit about NSC reform, particularly as it relates to how the NSC integrates with the Department of Defense and the dynamic between the two. And you tend to see about 6 major critiques of the NSC these days that Frank went over a little bit, and I agree with most of his points, that it is way too big, that it is at historic sizes right now, that it's way too reactive and driven by the tyranny of the inbox, that it has far too many meetings, that the inability to make decisions at lower levels means that senior folks like the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and the President are dealing with tactical level decisions over and over again that their staff should have handled, and therefore don't have a lot of time to focus on the big picture, the left and right parameters of what our policies should be. And then next, that reactivity means that they focus too much on crisis management and process management. It crowds out strategy development in a way that is entirely counterproductive to our national security. Next, and this gets to the point that Frank was making on implementation. The NSC as a staff and also as a system spends a lot of time on overseeing implementation decision-making, tactical level, what are we going to do to actually implement the president's vision here, as opposed to focusing on here's the left and right parameters, and also, as he pointed out, the later on, did we get it right? Can we assess whether or not we did a good job on that, or was it effective in any way? That actually disempowers the agencies in a lot of ways to not allow them to do what they should be doing on a day-to-day basis, executing the president's vision. And all this comes together in the biggest indictment that you hear over and over again, that there is micromanagement by the NSC, particularly of the Pentagon, but as well the rest of the interagency as well. And what goes with that is that there's a lot of duplication of effort, that NSC staffers are doing the work that the State Department should be doing, or that Pentagon civilians or military should be doing. And this has become the sort of microcosm of poor civil relations. But what's interesting to me is those critiques are usually leveled by people that are talking about it as though Tom Donnellan or Susan Rice or Steve Hadley woke up and said, you know what I really, really want to do is have more NSC meetings this year than anyone has ever had before. Or what I would love to do is be less strategic this year than I was last year. And having met these folks, first of all, it's highly unlikely that they've ever thought that, and I have no indication that that is actually their goal. But this is how the critiques are leveled against them, as though it's a deliberate thing, or they're just not they're not able to recognize it. I think most of them do recognize it, but there are trends at work here that make it incredibly difficult for them to pause and say, all right, let's kind of start over again and create a better system. I think for that reason, it's going to be difficult for our current administration to enact some real reforms to how they do business, but they've done some good work in a recent NSC reform that came out. So my thoughts are more for a future administration on how they might approach this. It would be great if I could offer some org charts or a national security presidential directive or something very formal in legislation, but frankly, most of what I have to offer is relationship advice, setting good habits early, making time for the things that matter, and strengthening relationships. So if you read a How to Have a Good Marriage book, you can probably come up with how to have a good NSC system.
NSC for dummies.
Exactly. The first being, and this is obvious to a defense crowd, is set roles and missions up front as a group and stick with them. The NSC process should be used to set the strategy, the policy priorities, and the left and right limits. The principals, who are leading agencies, they should be empowered to lead their agencies to actually execute these policies. And they should be those principals should be empowering their own staffs to actually make execution decisions. So I just said three things that were incredibly obvious to people who follow these issues, but they're not obvious to the people who are in the mix of this every single day. With that empowerment comes risk, and with risk comes the need to hold people accountable, and those are the tough challenges that people need to deal with as they think about this next system. Second is that you have to make time for strategy. That is another incredibly obvious statement. But it is so obvious that people beat themselves up about it all the time, but they don't actually make the time to be able to do so. Because crisis management will always overcome the need to say, wait a second, what's our vision here? What are our priorities? And how do we think about how do we want to execute them? If you set time early in administration, or even before an administration begins, to say, here's our vision, here's our priorities, here's our general parameters on how we want to execute that vision and priorities, you'll be much better off. You'll save yourself time later. But if you don't do it at the beginning, you're not going to make time for it 3 years on. And most critically, this relates to Frank's point about human capital. When new staff come on board to the NSC, or when new principals and deputies come on board in their agencies, they have most likely never sat in those chairs before. Or if they have not sat in those chairs with the team that they're working with before. The world has changed in some ways since they have done that. More than that, they probably don't have a good understanding of what their counterparts across the table bring to that table, whether that be the Deputy Secretary of State not having an incredibly great familiarity with what his vice chairman counterpart may be offering in a crisis, or the vice chairman not having a good sense of how that Deputy Secretary of State conceives of civilian guidance on use of force. So between those two, you have a dynamic of people who have the best of intentions, but don't necessarily know how to work together in a crisis. They've not worked on the same team before, and they are not necessarily using the same vocabulary when it comes to crisis management. So it's awkward to go to these senior level folks and say, we actually need you guys to do some team building, or we want to do some training, or we want to have some conversations about best practices in crisis management based on what the last team did or what we think we should do in the future. But it's critical from the beginning. If you don't do it at the very beginning, halfway through the administrations, is not the best time to say, hey, let's have a talk about what we all do here. It's a little awkward at that point. And then I have a few others that I could get to later in QA, but I think that the human capital piece of it is critical.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for attending. Apologize for the construction noise. If you need a team of construction professionals who are very diligent, I can connect you.
Loudly effective.
Right, exactly. Now, I want to address two things very briefly. First, just I think, like John kind of said up front, why defense reform matters, why I think hopefully this conversation helps expand it beyond just personnel and acquisition, and then kind of go to my background, which is Capitol Hill, and how I think Congress should be looking at itself as well as looking at the Pentagon and the NSC and other elements of the national security apparatus. So as I think John hopefully laid out, I think defense reform matters not primarily because of its budget implications, I would argue. The budget's great. Unfortunately, I think all too often it's seen as a budget issue. It's seen as a way to save money. And that message, I think, is bad for a number of reasons, not least of which is, you're telling, troops are reading in Army Times how the Pentagon wants to, do defense reform by increasing their TRICARE copays, or it's not a helpful message, and the truth is that there's always going to be budget pressures. Obviously, we need to use our money wisely as efficiently as possible, but the real priority should always be about increasing mission effectiveness, about doing the job more effectively, about fighting this inertia that I think everybody up here has talked about creating systems that can actually operate effectively, efficiently in an information age, not a Cold War era or 19th century general staff era. So I think that's the real challenge. That should always be anybody who's talking about defense reform. I hope we lead with that idea about effectiveness first, not dollars. There are, as we've seen with some of the personnel changes, the retirement changes that are being proposed, there are ways to improve systems and achieve savings at the same time. But I think we need to always focus on efficiencies or effectiveness first, not financial efficiencies. So when it comes to Congress, I think, first of all, I think Congress should be very involved in this defense reform conversation. I think they are. I think you've seen that from Senator McCain. Chairman Thornberry in the House are both very eager. But there are some internal problems that I think they need to address. And I also think that addressing those problems is vital because a lot of these issues, these intractable bureaucracies, the inertia, you have to some degree, have to be pushed or tweaked from the outside. There are things you can do internally, but if you look back at Goldwater-Nichols, a lot of that was forced on the Pentagon by Congress, obviously with help and support from people inside the Pentagon, inside the NSC. But it really, you had to have an external forcing function, and I think that's part of why Congress is important. And to do that effectively, I think Congress needs to up their own game, essentially. And I would point to two things. First of all, I think Congress needs to better educate itself. I've run the numbers, and in the House, only 30% of members of Congress sit on any of the so-called national security committees, so armed services, intel, foreign affairs, and homeland security. So less than 1 in 3 of the average member of Congress in the House gets any exposure to national security issues until there's a crisis, until there's an Iran deal, until there's something forcing them to pay attention. Instead, they're all creatures of their environment. They've got other committees they're working on. They've got other issues to address. So they may have one junior staff member who, in theory, covers national security and foreign affairs, but it's responsibility 5, 6, or 7, and they have no expertise in it. That's oftentimes that's not a problem because you've got experts on the relevant national security committees. But when you come to big things where every vote matters, whether it's sequestration, potential authorization of use of force, those votes beyond the 60 members of the House Armed Services Committee is actually where the bulk of the debate happens, and the vast majority of those folks spend almost no time learning about national security. So there's a general education problem. The Senate is slightly better, just because senators tend to be on more committees. So arguably their time investment in an individual committee is less, but roughly 60% of senators are on one of those 4 national security committees. Also, all senators get to vote on Senate-confirmed presidential nominees. So there's a little bit more natural forcing function, I think, in the Senate to actually pay attention to some of these issues. And you've got, probably the vast majority of senators hope to be president someday, so that probably also helps you naturally pay more attention to national security issues. I would argue there's a couple simple ways to help address this educational problem. One is just, there are already, House and Senate leadership already do these, large, full body classified briefings, or bring in administration experts to address the whole House, the whole Senate, in closed sessions. Those are great, but again, if you've got 435 members of the House and one Secretary of State briefing on the Iran deal, for example, it's not a very constructive conversation. And again, if it's not happening until the issue's on the table, one, it's probably already politicized. Number two, it's too late to have a constructive conversation. Also, I think, frankly, if it were up to me, I would take attendance and make it public. I don't think, for these members who aren't on national security committees, they don't have bases in their district. They don't have any of, the vast majority of them don't have any natural incentives to pay attention until they have to vote, until they have to issue a statement or Facebook post on whether they like the Iran deal or not. To get around that, one of the ways is just take attendance and make it public. Say, if you're the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader in the Senate, you say, look, national security is one of the, is vitally important. Most members have no prior experience to it unless they've been in the military, and usually if you've been in the military or in one of the national security, if you have a national security background, you're going to gravitate toward one of the national security committees already. So the members that you're trying to educate largely have no incentive to invest time up front to learn this issue. Senate and House leadership could, I would argue, create a system of more regular briefings and take attendance and kind of make it a priority. And I think that would actually help the conversation. And also, increased knowledge leads to increased effectiveness, I think, by Congress. So if you have more members of Congress who actually know what they're talking about and are paying attention, it's going to be easier to overcome the little parochial fights. It's going to be easier to put members in their place if they're just fighting for their little base. Everybody else can say, well, here's the big picture. And I think that ultimately helps the defense reform agenda. The last thing I'll say is I also think Congress needs to look at their committee structure. It's a little bit better for the Department of Defense, but for the Department of Homeland Security, for the Department of State, and even for the Department of Defense, you have multiple committees with varying levels of authority across both chambers of Congress that end up making Congress's voice splintered. And so when you come to trying to actually implement reform, I think Congress needs to have a strong singular voice, or at least the House and the Senate majority parties have to have a strong single voice. And when you've got power diffused at a minimum between the appropriations committees and the authorizing committees, that creates problems. In some cases, you also have multiple authorizing committees, multiple appropriations subcommittees that all have pieces of the pie. And that's largely for legacy historical reasons. I mean, it's the same exact type of inertia that you see within the Pentagon, you see within Congress, you see members protecting their turf. Instead, I would argue you need to combine, you need to have single points of authority as much as possible in the House and the Senate to actually do strong oversight, and as part of that, I think, promote reform in the national security enterprise. And I'll stop talking and turn it over to John.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, all four of you. really, really interesting stuff. I have just a few questions that I'd like to get maybe some brief answers from each of you, and then we'll open it up in case anybody else has any. Paul, let me start with you. I think you mentioned the MRAP, which is sort of like something that we elevate up as like how acquisition works at its best. And the thing about that though was that worked because they didn't go through the process, they went around it. Is it possible to just adapt that to make that the new process, that going around the process, the new process? And that's kind of part one of the question. Part two is that the MRAP, we're lucky it's a big and powerful and high tech vehicle, but not that high tech. We were able to design it, build it, field it quickly. I mean, I deployed in 2008, and there were no MRAPs, and within 3 months there were MRAPs everywhere. Everybody was having them. Everybody had them. Is it possible to do that with higher end platforms as well?
Yeah, great question. So I think about we're full on this front end, maybe like a 2-track process, right? So one is you're going to have to still have a deliberate acquisitions process that takes a long time for major platforms like ships and aircraft carriers and aircraft. An aircraft carrier has a lifespan of 50 years, right? So the Navy is this year laying the keel for the John Kennedy that will be fielded in 2020 and then stay in the force till 2070. So given that you're going to own it for 50 years, you might want to take the time to make sure that you're doing some things up front. There's no great rush to get it out the door immediately, right? And that's a process where I think we could still do a much better job, and there's been a lot of attention in the Pentagon on controlling costs, controlling requirements creep, and compressing some time schedules, right? But I think you need to have just a separate institutional process, one that's organic, one that doesn't require standalone task forces to allow rapid capability development. There are a host of things that have been created. I think in large part it's about sort of institutionalizing those in ways that are lasting, like Lauren talked about. And there are some of those within the services, the Air Force has them, and people are talking about creating something inside the Pentagon to do that. Because I do think it's a separate thing, right? The big hang up with MRAPs, which was fascinating, is it wasn't actually acquiring them. It wasn't industry. Once Secretary Gates told industry, I want this, go, we had thousands of MRAPs out the door within a year. It was requirements inside the Pentagon. There was a 2-year delay inside the Pentagon between the people in the field saying, we know we need MRAPs, this is what we want, we know it exists, we can buy it off the shelf, the technology was out there, and the Pentagon agreeing to do it. And so we need to compress that decision much, much, much quicker to make that happen.
How?
So the smart thing to do is to have a separate process, and there are things underway like joint urgent operational needs, joint emerging operational needs, or a little bit longer time frame, where the combatant commanders can submit requests, and then they get adjudicated in the Pentagon. So people are sort of aware of this. It's about sort of creating making this a focus for the institution, creating a pot of money that's available, creating a rapid capabilities office that can take these requirements and then make sure they actually, produce something in a quick amount of time. So I think we're sort of part way there in terms of making it happen, but we need to still kind of finish the job.
Can I point to this?
Please.
I'm very much in favor of the MRAP issues as it's been articulated here. But in my PhD, which I recently completed, I did a case study on one of my case studies on adaptation was the MRAP. And I'm still interviewing Marine generals and Marine officers today who believe that the MRAP was a flawed decision, that we wasted billions of dollars. And it's interesting that there are still people who don't understand the strategic influence of the casualties and how it was affecting things in Washington, D.C. But there are students down at Quantico today, and there are generals walking around today who still believe that the application of the MRAP in 2007 and beyond was bad tactics and a bad strategy and a large waste of money, and they're on the record.
Well, so what's interesting about this, I think the money thing, if you don't like the tactics of it and being in armored vehicles, I'm not sure what to say to that. The MRAP is not a very tactically maneuverable vehicle. There's a lot of criticism for that. I guess my view in Iraq at the time, and since then still, is that getting killed from point A to point B is not very tactical either, right? Like getting to where you're going without being killed is pretty valuable on the battlefield. So, but I think this issue of cost is a really important one. This was really criticized at the time. People saying, well, it's this $1 billion Kleenex, we're going to spend all this money and throw it away. And the answer is we did destroy a lot of MRAPs after the war that we didn't keep. So rapid adaptability requires accepting the fact that sometimes you're going to spend money today to get something you need today, and you're not going to need it tomorrow, and you're willing to accept that because it's vital to winning the war.
And that's the trade-off I was willing to
Yeah.
make. It's interesting that service cultures, service priorities, and the longer-term perspective of the people we put in the requirements and acquisition business would allow people to take short-term losses, as bloody and as heartless as it sounds, because it didn't fit the larger scheme of things. But that tension has to be worked with, and I'm not comfortable that we're really learning the right lessons that civilians need to micromanage or civilians need to jump in early. But because there were people in 2005 in the Army and Marine Corps who were pushing the right solution and knew it, and I heard those in 2005, and we clearly did not act on them. So we have to let that, and I think the Joint Urgent System was what some Marine Mavericks used to get around the service. And I think that's what Mr. Gates and some others actually acted upon. But this is a case study that requires, I think, a little more study and some documentation to learn. We have a study we did at NDU a few years ago. I think it's fairly much on the mark. But I know Mr. Carter and Mr. Gates have been promoting their perspective on things.
So we may not be learning lessons yet, but at least we're encountering them.
We're encountering them, and we haven't lessened, because when we've learned them, we've changed our behaviors.
Lauren, I know you want to
Okay.
jump in. Can I ask you a question as well
Sure.
that you can just kind of maybe tack onto there?
Mhm.
You mentioned some of the redundancies in the sort of NSC system, where you've got NSC staff doing what should by all rights be State Department staff, and that's something I think you see across the board when you have as many agencies and departments that we have. But it's interesting in the case of the NSC, because the NSC was sort of created in this recognition that we have this stovepipe, variegated system, and we need something above it to be coordinating.
Mhm.
Is it possible to kind of, now that NSC has started actually doing rather than just coordinating in a lot of ways, is it possible to sort of extract them back into that kind of umbrella role?
So let me first answer
Please.
one of the questions you asked earlier on the how. The how do we incorporate some of these lessons from the past MRAP example. So one piece of the how is that rapidity is going to require some acceptance of failure that does not exist right now within the Pentagon. And not only acceptance of failure, but highlighting this is good failure. Like that we tried this, we did it fast, it didn't work, and that's good. We like that. Right now we have good, quote unquote, examples of really, really bad, expensive, late failure. We need to figure out ways to incentivize early failure in the acquisition system, that will be part and parcel of any kind of rapid adaptability system that doesn't really exist today. It may within small communities, but you don't see Secretary Carter out publicizing this was a good failure. That's going to have to be a part of the conversation in order to change the culture. Now, in terms of the redundancy in the state, in the NSC system, I heard an interesting proposal that I'm not quite sure how I feel about, but basically recommended that instead of, let me put it this way, that the NSC should be purely focused, only ever allowed to do strategic planning, like at the high level, vision level work of the administration, as well as the assessment. And that anytime there's any sort of crisis, that you should task organize people from agencies, DoD, State Department, and the intelligence community, and elsewhere, to focus on that crisis for a temporary period of time, where they're connected to the NSC, where they are reporting to it in some way, probably to a deputies committee, but they are not part of the NSC itself. So that way you protect the NSC's role, like this is what you do, thinking longer term and making sure we have a vision for what our priority is. And that the day-to-day, here's tactically how we're going to do that, and thinking about the actual implementation of it is delegated to the agencies. So that one of the reasons you see a lot of redundancy is that, frankly, agencies are slow. The NSC tends to be in the office 18 hours a day. They can turn a recommendation paper to the president the next day if they need to. The State Department typically can't do that. DoD typically can't do that, largely because of their own bureaucracy. If you start to recognize those strengths as well as want to incentivize the roles, that's an interesting way to think about it. I don't know if it would work in practice, but it's a concept that you could think about in order to protect the various roles of the agencies versus the NSC.
Cool. Justin, if we can switch gears a little bit right now, the Senate Armed Services Committee is holding hearings this morning, as you know, on sort of addressing Goldwater Nichols and things that have changed since Goldwater Nichols was crafted 29 years ago, and talking about whether or not, what comes next. Do we need more reform now, and what should that look like? I wonder, just because of your Hill experience, if you can kind of walk us through the process of how that happens, and then also maybe if you have an assessment of whether or not it's actually likely that something is going to come of that and what that might look like.
Sure. Let me say a couple things. One, I think the process, Senator McCain obviously is very interested in Coldwater Nichols reform. He's had, I think he had a hearing yesterday, he's having a hearing today. He's laid it out as one of his kind of agenda items for next year, for next year's National Defense Authorization bill. And I think what's interesting is, on the House side, you've got Chairman Thornberry, and who's also very interested in reform, but they're operating on different time cycles or time scales. McCain may only have 2 years as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. If the Senate flips party control next year, not only does he not remain chairman, he doesn't get to be ranking member even because of kind of Senate Republican conference rules. So he very much has, basically 13 months, 14 months left in his reign as chairman. He sees this next year's bill as his last, his only guaranteed chance to kind of make his impact on defense policy. In the House, you've got Chairman Thornberry. He's got, he's in his, this is still his first year. Next year will be his second year as chairman. They're term limited to 6 years over there. And I think most prognosticators don't see any real threat this coming year for Democrats picking up control of the House. Probably not even 2 years after that. So he really has, a full 6 years to do his work. And you've seen that even in the two versions of the NDA that came out this year. Thornberry was more deliberative, trying to lay some steps, I think, go after kind of clearing some brush to make room for bigger reforms, whereas McCain was, kind of going straight in, trying to make big reforms as quickly as possible. All that said, I think means that when McCain talks about trying to reform Coldwater Nichols, I think there's, 99% sure there's going to be some Coldwater Nichols reforms of some form in next year's Senate NDAA. I think there's also going to be, this is, off, not the topic here, but healthcare, military healthcare reform, other things like that McCain's just heading for it, and he sees his opportunity. So what he's doing now is bringing in experts, laying the groundwork, trying to figure out what those reforms should be. I think the interesting thing to watch is what the Pentagon says and does through this whole process. If you go back and look at the history from the 80s when it first came in, there were huge fights within the Pentagon over whether this was good or not, and some of those same I don't know if it's incentives or structures within the Pentagon still exist between services. Obviously, I think to anyone who pays attention to it to a limited degree, we would say certainly there's room for some structural changes to how the Pentagon operates, both in terms of military operations. How do we make sure we're actually able to operate, make decisions quickly, move I think Oren just said it best. I mean, NSC is operating, can turn things in a day. Even the Pentagon, this thing that many of us think is one of the more effective government agencies out there, time scales are very different. How do we get around those issues? How do we, what does jointness actually look like in the 21st century? There's a lot of big issues there. So it'll be interesting to see what McCain actually proposes, how the Pentagon and the different pieces of the Pentagon respond to that over the next 12 months.
Frank?
I want to talk about the metaphor of Goldwater's Nichols. To me, is not really the appropriate kind of language. If you looked at Goldwater's Nichols, it was about power relationships, it was about changing culture, it was about educational reforms and requirements to incentivize jointness in a sense. There's no structural change or roles and missions change in Goldwater's Nichols. The only structural change, I believe, was the establishment of the vice chairman's office in legislation and rank, which again was something that all the services objected to. I came into town in 1983 and was working for Mr. Lehman and the Commandant of the Marine Corps immediately, and this is all we were, fighting was, I think Key West 2 is the better metaphor, with roles, functions, and missions allocated with the associated resourcing, maybe with that, and more structural change, something dramatic. What I do like, I love Mr. Thornberry's work. It's down in the nitty-gritty of acquisition reform, where there's almost no rewards for the time and the effort, very laborious. But I also like Mr. McCain right now is going, I think, after more structural aspects that a Key West 2 might be the right metaphor. And he's focusing on the orphans and the seams, and he's also looking at the parochial services and the expanding mission range, where we have these space, cyber, SOF kinds of activities that are kind of more important perhaps than the past and maybe kind of letting go. So I think the hard part for Mr. McCain now is to find the resources to establish the things that are the orphans and the missions that he wants to strengthen. So SOF, cyber as a service perhaps, could be some things. And then getting at some of the redundancies or perhaps some of the archaic barnacles that have accrued over a long period of time. One of my favorites, I spent 2 years in the Department of the Navy, and if you want to save 6,000 billets in the Pentagon right now, I'd get rid of the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, and the Department of the Air Force. You wouldn't save as much as you'd think from that, but you would take out a layer. You would have some savings. So some functions in the budgetary or legislative thing might have to go to the Chief of Naval Operations and back to the Chief of Staff, but there's already a lot of redundancy in that area. And I think it might enhance the Secretary's authority a little bit to deal directly with the services and not have that extra layer in there. I'd eliminate at least 3 of the COCOMs, AFRICOM, Northern Command, and Southcom. I'd have some JTFs, like we have JTFs working in some of these areas now, but I'd eliminate those kinds of headquarters. I would create SOF as a service, as has been suggested in testimony late by Mr. Martinage. There's consolidations in the agencies and space and missile commands where we have a lot of redundancy right now. And there's probably even some room someplace in a Goldwars, Nichols, or Key West 2 where for some congressional reform might be considered in terms of the committees. I don't think there's sufficient oversight in detailed committees, right? So I like what Mr. McCain's doing. I wish he had longer time and, to kind of get at some of the structural things. But those are the efficiencies you need to garner. You need to get rid of some of the barnacles so you can invest in some of the new things we need for the 21st century.
I think maybe we should take this list over there after we break up here.
Go up to a bar or to the hill?
Yeah. We are just really at the limit of our time. I just want to ask if there's anybody that has any brief questions that can kind of maybe inform our final comments. Please.
No question. I just
There's a microphone here if you need.
no question. I just want to thank you for your insights on the Congress. I just moved to Washington D.C. from California just recently, and I started attending some of the hearings, and because of the Iran nuclear deal, the hearing. But what you said is so true, because not much interest on foreign policy especially on the House side. Like you said, is it because they are too busy or no interest, or whether foreign policy is so important nowadays? How can you not?
That's
I mean,
true.
in my case, it's the Asia Pacific. You look at the South China Sea. I mean, I just wanted to say thank you, I guess.
Thank you for your comments, and it is, it has been very insightful. I think it's a very opaque building sometimes, so it's been very helpful to have you here. There's another question in the back.
Yes, my name's Jim Obrowski, and I may be the person who's older than Fred. But
Maybe.
two key points quickly for Lawrence and for Paul. Congratulations on the 2012 defense guidance. I don't think many people understood that was the Mullen and Gates way of doing defense, and its roots are 6 years before 2006. It's a continuity. You guys put together a great document if anybody cared to read it and understand it. For Mr. Johnson, a couple papers you posted on how much you spent on defense recently, I found very interesting. Do you have a long-term construct, say for the course 30 years, of what we want to be spent, what fraction of GDP we want to be spending on defense?
Good question. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. I think, people have thrown around percentages of GDP in the past. Even at Heritage, we've previously had specific percentages. I'm not sure that's. I think that's helpful to understand context and scale, but I'm not sure it's a helpful target. I think, at different times, the world's going to be different. And so I think we have to build our national security enterprise, our Department of Defense, based on an assessment of what we care about in terms of, goals and priorities around the world, and then what we need to protect those things that we care about. And at different times, that's going to look different. Personally, I think we should be spending a lot more than we are right now if we actually want our military, our national security enterprise to do what we say we want it to do. But putting a specific percentage of GDP on it, I think just it's helpful to understand, but not necessarily as a target.
Okay. I want to expand on this a little bit, but I don't want to make sure I don't preempt anybody.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to chat more after, perhaps.
Okay, really quickly, since I'm stuck with doing that 30-year plan, okay? And to complement the shipbuilding plan. And have been through 3 defense build-outs in the process. I'm older than Frank. And helped plan the second one. Firstly, in peacetime, defense usually comes down to somewhere between 3.2 and 3.4% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It tends to grow with the GDP across time. Right now, we're running about 2.4% of GDP real growth per year. This means in 30 years, how big is the GDP changed? How big has the GDP become in real terms?
Mm-hmm.
Turns out it's double.
Mm-hmm.
This implies a rather substantial potential growth in defense. I'm using a working fiction at the moment of planning 1% below GDP growth as a defense hardware piece. When I do that, I get some interesting results. Take the 30-year image or the 30-year shipbuilding plan and discover something real interesting. Once you take the Ohio replacement out of it, or just recognize it, and you say the customary number, we have had 0 real growth in ship construction for 25 years, and we plan 0 real growth for 30 years. Does that make sense to you? If I choose to use this construct of 1% below, set 2018 at $17 billion, which is about where we'll be, I turn out to completely envelop the Ohio program. I turn out to completely fund out of that program every single midlife overhaul for the entire naval force and have $60 billion left over, and I haven't busted the budget. That is the kind of a view that would be really helpful, because what it does is it provides some planning guidance that lets services work their problems. We are at the point where the inheritance from the Cold War is just about dead. We're at the point where we have to start doing some new stuff, and the span has gotten larger. And we're at the point where personnel changes have had immense.
Sorry to interrupt, but do you have a question that you'd like Justin to kind of respond to as well? Or?
Justin would like to respond to the idea. I'd love to have it.
Well, how about we chat for a minute afterwards, because I'd actually love to chat further.
Any other very, very brief questions?
Very quick,
Okay.
Mike Clauser. Mr. Johnson, I wanted to just press you a little bit. You named 4 committees that had to do with national security, armed services, intel, foreign affairs, homeland security. But I didn't hear you talk about appropriations, which funds it all, transportation infrastructure, which pays for the Coast Guard, ways and means, if you want to talk about trade policy, oversight and government reform, which can yank any skeleton in defense out of the closet, and even judiciary, which has oversight over the Patriot Act. So I would encourage people to think expansively about national security and about sort of the different abilities that are brought to the table in Congress.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's a fair critique. I think for measuring, I was trying to measure House versus Senate in terms of percentage of time or interest, and that was the easiest way to do it. When I added in the defense appropriations subcommittees, it was essentially the same percentage-wise. The one pushback I would argue just philosophically or experientially is that, yes, judiciary covers FISA, but that's, maybe the once a year or once every couple of years where they actually, at a member level, actually pay much attention to it. There may be, the chairman of the subcommittee that covers that might have more attention. So I think in terms of actually changing the rough order of magnitude of people, members of Congress who actually are paying attention in any level of depth, I'm not sure it changes, but I mean, obviously you're right in terms of these other committees having pieces of jurisdiction.
All right, we are beyond our limit, so I'm going to ask you guys to kind of make it very brief, maybe in 30 seconds, just any closing comments. And I wonder if, and this is going to put you on the spot, because I know nobody's going to like this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If there was one thing that needed to be done in terms of defense reform, and I know the answer is there are a lot of things, but if there was one thing that should be a priority, what would you say it is? Frank, we'll start with you.
It's the NSC reform. You have to get the strategy right first.
Okay, Paul?
I'd like to see a renewed program of experimentation in the department. Go out, take things out to the field, try new things, and be willing to fail.
Interesting.
Early, small, and fast.
Lauren?
A running theme across all of our comments was human capital. I think if we do rewiring diagrams, new org charts, new statutes, none of that will matter if we don't focus on the human capital piece at the forefront of all of that.
Justin?
I'm going to throw something completely different. I think we need to be able to fire civilian employees more easily. I think that...
Absolutely. Paul and I should have been fired.
Right, exactly. I think, it's a longer conversation and it's in personnel issues, but I think the fact that if you're a young high performer, you're not going to work in an environment where 30% of the employees are dead weight.
Yeah.
And I think if you actually want innovation, that 30% is a problem. Anyway, long story short, fire poor performing civilian employees.
All right, on that note, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for the four of you this weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
And have a nice Friday.